Plugins for Jester. Hi, my name is John, and I've been working on a version of Jester that allows for plugins. Before we get into a lot of detail, let's go ahead and take a look at what happens when a website grows and you add features to it, and where plugins get involved and really can help design and make the website easier to read, understand, and program. Okay, here's our example website. It doesn't do a whole lot. It shows 7 web pages. It has an index page, an about page, a login page that allows you to log in if you already have an account, a register page to register if you don't have an account, a welcome page, and 2 other pages, details and special status. And this website isn't about anything in particular. It's just a nice, simple website. I'm importing Jester, of course, and I'm also importing a library that I've written myself that contains all of these HTML generation procedures. So these return a string containing the HTML of each page that's being passed in. Some of these pages are being passed in the request object, which gives me details about what was sent into this page. For example, if I want to check if a person says logging in successfully or not, I pass in the request information showing me the post variables from their login attempt. Speaking of that, some of these pages will require login. So let's go ahead and make both the details page down here and the special status page up here reflect that. So if you're not logged in, it will redirect you back to the index. Otherwise, it'll show the page. Let's add a little bit more. You know, I want to track who's visiting my website. Plus, in order really to log someone in or not log someone in, I'm going to need to use a database of some kind. So let's go ahead and establish for each page that's being started a connection to a database. This is typically how you do it with a local database or with a database like MySQL or PostgreSQL. And you want to do it for each individual route, and because the web framework, both Jester and some of the other ones out there, are designed to be threaded. It gives your server the ability to respond to multiple requests at the same time. That's great, but when you're running in threads, you really don't want to access any kind of global variables unless it's designed specifically to be handled in a safe manner from a thread. And so generally speaking, what's done is you in fact create a new connection to the database. Now for some databases like MongoDB, you don't really want to do that, and I'll actually talk about that at the very end, a way to get around that. But here we are, recording each visit into that database and using that database to do logins and registrations. Let's add a little bit more. I want to track where people in the world are based on their IP address, and the value of this is questionable sometimes because you're not guaranteed to know where a person is in the world by their IP address, but it's not a bad way to track information. And so here we are. We're calling an API of some kind using a routine I wrote, storing that variable in G, and then when I record the visit, I'm adding that to what I'm logging. Let's add a little bit more. I want to be able to pass messages between web pages. For example, when you try to log in, here's the login function down here. If something goes wrong with that login, I want to be able to pass a message on to the next page you're being redirected to, in this case the welcome message. Basically, one of the ideal ways and the most common way to pass information between web pages. In other words, let's say there's something wrong with the form you're filling out, or maybe the form went well and you want to send a success message onto whatever page comes up next. What you do is you store that message in an encrypted cookie of some kind on the user's web browser so that the next page can pull that cookie in and display that information on the screen. And that's what we're doing here. And in fact, you'll see here, we are in fact now passing on these cookie messages into each of the pages so that they can display whatever message it's receiving. And most of the time, of course, there won't be any messages in there, but when they are there, they can put them up. Okay, we've added plenty to the website, and at this point, I can't even show you the whole website because these 7 pages have gotten pretty wordy, and a lot is happening, and a lot is being repeated over and over again for each route in the system. This is nim. I could totally create a template that has these first 4 lines for each page put into a single line, but it becomes somewhat less obvious what's going on. I'd have to go and then reference that template, and if that template's calling other routines, things can get complex once a website gets big enough. How can we make this system, a little bit simpler? Well, let's use some plugins. Here's our first one. Rather than create a brand new database connection manually for each route, let's go ahead and use a plugin to do it. So someone writes a Jester plugin here for connecting to Postgres, and here it is. It's creating a variable. Now this variable is local to the scope of the thread created for that web page. So it is created at the beginning of the route, even though you don't see it here. That's what happens. This variable is read-write, and it is available. And the important thing is when this plugin is called, a plugin actually isn't a single procedure. It kind of looks like you're calling a procedure here, but you're not. Using a naming convention, it actually calls 3 procedures, and they make those calls at different points. One of them is called at the very beginning of the request. One of them is called at the very end. So in this particular case, not only are you getting a database connection, and it's established at the beginning of each request, when the route is finished, it will actually close that database connection, which is what you want to do with a database. And that routine is called regardless of how you actually respond at the end of each route. So if you're responding with an actual web page, that works, or if you're responding with a redirect or anything else you might do, the final procedure for DB Connect plugin is called. Let's add another plugin. Here we're just getting rid of one more line from each route, where we're automatically creating a new variable that contains geographic information about the IP address of the current request. In this particular case, it's creating a local SQLite database so that it can cache the queries, so it's not hitting the API service over and over and over again. If you happen to have already visited within the last 5 minutes, it'll pull it out of the local cache. Again, less is cluttering our screen now. All right, here's a plugin that does not return anything. All it does is simply keeps track of every web request that comes in, basically giving you a log of everything, and it uses the database created in this plugin. So plugins are order sensitive, and it uses the geographic information from this plugin. So this plugin has dependencies on these 2 plugins in some way, shape, or form. Again, we have less code to look at. Things have gotten just a little bit simpler. Now we're going to use a plugin that doesn't necessarily make our code shorter, but it makes it more flexible. There's a lot of information at the start of every query that might be useful to your different procedures. And so rather than pass in the request for each of these pages, I'm passing in a JSON document. And this plugin here creates that JSON document. And it contains everything pretty much that's in the request object, but also contains things like the environment variables in case you're launching this website inside of a Docker. It contains more and more stuff as I find it to be useful, including command line parameters. So if you launch your website with command line parameters, those will show up in your JSON default JSON document. It makes things a little bit more flexible and easier to use. And just for fun, I went and added to that JSON document right here, showing you that you can in fact add additional information into that JSON document and pass it into whatever functions you're needing to do. Let's add another plugin. This plugin does the cookie messages thing. And again, this one doesn't necessarily make your code shorter, but it makes it more obvious what you're doing. It's all the hard work of taking your data, encrypting it. Well, it's not even so much encrypting it, it's just creating it in a form that's easily parsable in the reverse. It actually makes a little miniature JSON document that's stored into the cookie. But what it does is it allows you to call this right here. You automatically have a source of all your cookie messages, which can be passed into your other functions. And you can call a method of CM where you can pass in the type of message as well as a string that represents the content of the message. So I would use this, for example, in some of my websites to show a dialog where the color of that dialog box is either green for success or red for danger or blue for info or yellow for warning, and then also show the message. All kinds of ways you can do that. Let's add another plugin. And this one's an Auth plugin. This one actually handles your users for logging in and logging out. Again, we've got some methods for the plugin. We have the plugin here where it's getting passed in the database that's being created by the DB Connect here at the top. This user will be an object that contains information about the user that's logged in if they're logged in. And here is a template that handles redirection in the event they're not logged in. So only on pages where I want to do this anonymous redirect, I can just preface it with this template, and it handles all that, and in this case redirects it back to index. So I think in general, because I've got about 6 websites I have currently active right now, and I've found the use of these plugins, although honestly I'm the one that wrote most of these plugins, so for me, of course they're easier. But I suspect a lot of folks would find these to be useful, hopefully. Give me feedback on that. So, current status of this. Right now, this is a fork of Jester called Jester with Plugins. I'm in arrangements with Dominic, who's the person who's managing the main Jester library. Because this thing is going to be monkeying with a lot of the internals of Jester, we're basically keeping this into a separate fork. This fork is available on Nimble right now, so you can download it and play with it. It is experimental, but you can use it right now, and some of these plugins already exist. In fact, they're on Nimble as well. But when we've gotten a lot of the bugs out and things seem really, really stable, we're going to, at least the plan is, to re-merge these back into Jester so we still have one primary framework. In fact, here are the plugins that are in there right now. Jester GeoIP does an actual API lookup to a free geo-tracking service based on the IP you track it. Based on the IP you pass it, and it in fact does the caching. Jester JSON is a very simple library that does what I described. It puts everything into a JSON variable that you might find useful. And Jester cookie messages, which I use quite a bit in my websites. And I have this highlighted here. I've not written a PostgreSQL Jester plugin, but I have written one for MongoDB. MongoDB, in fact, has a bit of a quirk to it. Typically, you can get away with connecting live to a SQL database when the web page first starts. So when the thread begins, you just connect it to it and then disconnect it at the end. You cannot get away with that with MongoDB, because if you have security turned on, it may take up to 4 seconds for that connection to be fully established and authenticated. Yeah, no one wants to wait 4 seconds per web page. That'd be a horrible website. And so what it does is it creates a pool of connections when the web server first starts, and then manages that pool. It detects whether the pool connections have gone stale and reestablishes them in the background, and basically does it dynamically. And what happens is when you, in fact, use the plugin, it gets the next connection available, uses it, and then releases that connection back into the pool. So it's a thread-safe pooled database connection. So those 4 plugins are available now. This fork is experimental. I do want to emphasize this. I am using it on 6 public websites, and I can talk about 2 of them because they're mine. nimgame.online and tech.radio. nimgame.online is a kind of a demo site of some JavaScript games that have been written in Nim by other people. And tech.radio is a podcast I do. It's a weekly radio show and podcast that I enjoy doing, talking about and gossiping about technology each week. All right, hopefully you all found this to be useful. Thanks for listening. I'll see you around the net.